My home in Oak Ridge Estates was not the biggest or the fanciest, but it was mine, and I took pride in maintaining it properly. The previous owners had struggled with water drainage issues, which was evident from the moisture damage in the basement when I first toured the property. After saving for 6 months following my purchase, I had finally installed a proper drainage system that directed water away from my foundation and out toward the community green belt where it could safely dissipate. The system was hardly noticeable. I had deliberately chosen materials that blended with the landscaping and followed the natural contours of the yard. The 4-inch drainage pipe barely peeked out at the edge of my property, but it solved what had been a serious issue. No more puddles around the foundation. No more damp basement smell. Problem solved, or so I thought. I was tending to my front garden on a sunny Saturday morning when a shadow fell across the flower bed I was weeding. Looking up, I found myself staring at an immaculately dressed woman with a clipboard clutched tightly in her perfectly manicured hands. Her hair was styled in what could only be described as an architectural achievement, not a strand out of place despite the light breeze. "Good morning," I said, brushing dirt from my hands as I stood up. "Can I help you?" "I am Margaret Kensington, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association," she replied without returning my greeting. "There have been reports of unauthorized modifications to your property." Her eyes fixed accusingly on the drainage outlet at the edge of my lawn. My drainage solution. My very necessary drainage solution. "That is a standard drainage pipe," I explained. "The house had water issues when I bought it. This diverts rainwater safely away from the foundation." Margaret's lips thinned to a tight line. "Any exterior modifications require prior HOA approval. This is clearly stated in Section 4.7 of the Community Bylaws which you signed when purchasing your property." She handed me a sheet of paper. "This is an official warning. You have 10 days to submit a modification request or remove the unauthorized installation." The radio on my porch was playing softly, and I could hear the meteorologist mentioning unusual weather patterns developing for the season. But my attention was focused on this woman who was threatening the solution to my water problems. "I will look into the proper procedures," I responded calmly. "But this drainage system is preventing water damage to my home." Margaret offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "Rules are rules. We maintain property values through uniformity and compliance. Your pipe is unsightly and was installed without approval." As she walked away, I noticed her pausing at several other houses on my street, making notes on her clipboard. Later, I would learn that Margaret had made it her personal mission to clean up Oak Ridge Estates since becoming HOA president 3 months ago. That evening, I read through the warning notice more carefully. The potential fines for noncompliance were steep, much more than my monthly mortgage payment. I also pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws, a thick document I had admittedly skimmed when purchasing the house. As I flipped through the pages, the weather report on the television caught my attention again. This unusual weather pattern could bring record precipitation to our area in the coming months, the meteorologist explained, gesturing to swirling cloud formations on the map behind him. Residents should prepare for potential flooding in low-lying areas. I glanced out my window at the now barely visible drainage pipe and felt the first stirrings of unease. A perfect storm of bureaucracy and actual weather was brewing, and somehow I knew my simple drainage pipe was about to become the center of both. The next morning, I spread the HOA documents across my kitchen table, determined to find exactly what rules govern drainage solutions. Armed with a yellow highlighter and strong coffee, I began methodically reading every paragraph related to exterior modifications and water management. 3 hours and 2 coffee refills later, I made a surprising discovery. Section 4.7 did indeed require approval for modifications, but Section 8.3 specifically addressed drainage. Homeowners are responsible for ensuring proper water drainage from their property in a manner that does not negatively impact neighboring properties or community areas. Even more interesting was Addendum C, which stated, functional drainage solutions that do not significantly alter the aesthetic character of the property or community may be implemented without prior approval if they conform to county water management guidelines. My drainage pipe clearly qualified under this exception. It was functional, minimally visible, and complied with county guidelines. I felt a surge of vindication as I carefully photographed T's relevant sections. The following day, I methodically documented my drainage system from multiple angles, showing how it blended with the landscaping and functioned without disrupting the community aesthetic. Not wanting to leave anything to chance, I contacted Thomas Ramirez, a professional landscaper and drainage specialist who had installed systems throughout our county. For a reasonable fee, he agreed to assess my installation and provide a written evaluation. This is textbook proper drainage installation, Thomas confirmed as he examined my system. You have got the right gradient, appropriate materials, and it directs water exactly where it should go. I can put that in writing for you. His professional assessment in hand, I composed a formal response to the HOA. The letter was respectful but firm, citing the relevant bylaw exceptions, including photographs and Thomas's professional endorsement. I printed everything on quality paper, organized it in a folder, and mailed it with delivery confirmation to ensure it reached the HOA office. For several days I heard nothing. I began to hope that my thorough response had resolved the matter. Then, returning home from work on Thursday evening, I discovered a notice taped to my front door. The HOA had conducted an inspection of my property while I was away. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, like a harbinger of the troubles to come. 2 days later, an official letter arrived bearing the HOA logo. I opened it with growing apprehension, which quickly turned to disbelief as I read the contents. My request for exception had been denied. The letter cited a newly amended subsection requiring that all water management systems maintain consistent community aesthetic standards and utilize approved materials and designs. My hands trembled slightly as I read further. The letter specified that my drainage pipe used non-conforming materials and created an inconsistent visual element in the community landscape. It demanded removal within 14 days or implementation of their suggested alternatives, which involved an underground system costing nearly 5 times what I had spent on my functional solution. Determined to resolve this through proper channels, I attended the next HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse. The building was relatively new, a point of pride for the community with its expensive furnishings and large meeting spaces. I signed up to speak during the open forum portion of the meeting. When my turn came, I approached the small podium facing the board members, who sat elevated on a dais like judges in a courtroom. I presented my case methodically, showing photographs, citing bylaw exceptions, and sharing the professional assessment. I explained the water damage risks to my foundation if proper drainage was not maintained. "Thank you for your presentation," Margaret said when I finished, not bothering to look up from her notes. "But the Architectural Review Committee has already made its determination. Your current installation does not meet our standards. Next item on the agenda." But what specifically does not meet standards? I asked, unwilling to be dismissed so easily. I have demonstrated compliance with Section 8.3 and Addendum C. Margaret looked up then, her expression cold. The decision has been made. Motion to proceed with the next agenda item. Seconded, said another board member immediately. Motion carries, Margaret declared, bringing down her gavel with finality. As I gathered my materials and walked toward the exit, I noticed several homeowners avoiding eye contact. Only one, an older gentleman named Frank, gave me a sympathetic nod. Outside in the parking lot, he approached me. "They did the same thing to me last year about my garden trellis," he said quietly. "Fighting them is usually more trouble than it is worth. Most of us just comply." I drove home that evening feeling a mixture of frustration and determination. The system was stacked against individual homeowners, but I still believed in following proper procedures. What I did not yet realize was how severely my faith in those procedures would be tested in the coming weeks. The certified letter arrived exactly 1 week after the HOA meeting. The red "urgent" stamp across the envelope left no doubt about its contents. Inside was a formal notice of violation, threatening daily fines of $100 for continued noncompliance. At that rate, I would be paying an extra $3,000 per month, an impossible sum on my budget. The letter specified that removal must be completed within 7 days, with photographic evidence submitted to the HOA office confirming completion. It was signed by Margaret Kensington, with a handwritten note at the bottom. Community standards must be uniformly enforced. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the numbers. The cost of fighting this through legal channels would likely exceed the fines, at least initially. With reluctance that felt like acid in my stomach, I made the decision to comply while continuing to seek resolution through other means. The following Saturday, I dismantled my drainage system piece by piece. Each twist of the wrench and pull of the shovel felt like dismantling my own security. I worked slowly, methodically, photographing each stage of the removal process. The before and after pictures were striking, showing the clean, functional system being reduced to bare soil. As I worked, I noticed my neighbor Carol watching from her porch. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away and went inside. The message was clear. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had fallen afoul of the HOA. I completed the removal by sundown, my back aching and hands blistered. The empty trench where my drainage pipe had been looked like an open wound in my landscaping. I took final photographs showing the complete removal and sent them to the HOA email address along with a formal statement. Drainage system removed under protest. Homeowner maintains this removal creates significant risk of water damage to property. That evening, a light rain fell. Nothing severe, just a gentle spring shower lasting about 20 minutes. I watched from my window as small puddles began forming exactly where they had before my drainage solution. One puddle in particular formed alarmingly close to my foundation. By morning, I could see a damp spot forming on my basement wall. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA documenting this immediate consequence, complete with photographs of the puddles and basement dampness. As a result of the required removal of my drainage system, I wrote, water is now accumulating against my foundation, causing damage that will worsen with continued precipitation. Please reconsider your decision in light of this documented harm. My finger hovered over the send button on the email containing the letter and photographs. After a moment of hesitation, I pressed it decisively. Whatever happened next, I wanted a clear record that I had warned them of the consequences. The response came 2 days later, a form letter stating that my concerns had been noted and that I should consider implementing one of their approved drainage solutions, which required professional installation at a minimum cost of $2,500. The dismissive tone made my blood pressure rise. Over the next few days, I attempted to rally support among my neighbors. I knocked on doors, politely explaining my situation and asking if others had experienced similar issues. The responses were illuminating. "We had to tear out our garden trellis," said the Johnsons at number 47. "They made us repaint our door even though the color difference was barely noticeable," shared Mrs. Taylor at number 32. Everyone had a story, but no one was willing to speak up publicly. "We cannot afford to fight them," was the common refrain. "It is not worth the trouble." Meanwhile, the weather forecasts grew increasingly concerning. The local news began running special segments on the unusual weather pattern developing over our region. The meteorologist pointed directly at our county on the map as she explained the potential impact. "We are looking at potentially record-breaking rainfall in the coming weeks," she said, her expression serious. "Areas that have experienced flooding in the past should take precautions now. This low-pressure system is unlike anything we have seen this time of year." I watched the forecast with growing alarm, knowing my home was now vulnerable in a way it had not been just weeks before. That night, I checked the basement again, noting how the damp spot had grown slightly larger from just the light rain earlier in the week. If the meteorologist was right about what was coming, I was facing serious trouble. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as I unloaded bags of sand from my car trunk. The Weather Service had upgraded their forecast from heavy rain to potential flooding, and I was taking no chances with my now vulnerable foundation. Working methodically in the growing wind, I stacked sandbags around the perimeter of my house, focusing on the areas where puddles had formed during the light rain earlier that week. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I positioned the last bag. It was an email notification from the HOA. The subject line read, "Violation, unauthorized exterior materials." With dirt-covered hands, I opened the message to find that the sandbags were deemed unsightly emergency measures that violated community aesthetic standards. I was ordered to remove them immediately or face additional fines. The irony was not lost on me. I was now being penalized for trying to protect my home from damage caused by complying with their previous demands. I took photographs of the sandbags and the threatening sky, then continued my preparations despite the warning. Some rules simply had to be broken when safety was at stake. Inside, I spread out detailed topographical maps of our community that I had obtained from the county records office. Using my training from engineering courses in college, I mapped the natural water flow patterns through our neighborhood, calculating how the removal of my drainage system would affect runoff during heavy rain. The results confirmed my fears. Without my drainage pipe directing water safely to the greenbelt, runoff from my property and several neighbors would now follow the natural slope of the land directly toward the southeastern corner of the neighborhood. I double-checked my calculations and felt a chill when I realized the implications. I compiled all this information into a comprehensive report, complete with water flow predictions and potential damage assessments. This was no longer about just my property. Several homes could be affected if the rainfall was as severe as predicted. The next morning, I hand-delivered the report to the HOA office, requesting an emergency review given the imminent weather situation. Through the glass door of the office, I watched the receptionist place my carefully prepared document into a stack of papers without even glancing at its contents. My warning was literally being added to a pile of ignored concerns. That evening, the HOA called an emergency town hall meeting. For a moment, I felt relief that they were finally taking the situation seriously, until I read the full announcement. The meeting was primarily to discuss final preparations for the upcoming spring gala to be held at the clubhouse that weekend. The weather was mentioned only as a minor agenda item. I arrived early and took a seat near the front of the community room. The space filled quickly as neighbors filed in, many discussing the storm warnings in hushed, concerned tones. Margaret called the meeting to order with 3 sharp taps of her gavel. Before we address the main agenda regarding our gala celebration, I would like to briefly address the weather concerns some residents have raised, she began, her tone dismissive. The meteorological reports are, in my view, overly cautious. We have experienced heavy rain before without incident. She gestured to a community map displayed on the wall behind her. Our drainage systems are more than adequate for typical precipitation. There is no need for unsightly emergency measures that violate our community standards. As she spoke, my eyes were drawn to the map she had referenced. It was a detailed rendering of Oak Ridge Estates, with elevation markings I had not noticed before. Suddenly, something caught my attention that I had missed in my own analysis. The clubhouse, our community's pride and joy, sat at the lowest elevation point in the entire neighborhood, if my calculations about the redirected water flow were correct. My heart raced as I traced the invisible path water would take from my property and surrounding homes. Without proper drainage systems to redirect it, all that water would flow directly toward the clubhouse. The recently renovated, expensively furnished clubhouse that was scheduled to host the spring gala in just 3 days. I raised my hand to speak, but Margaret had already moved on to discussing gala preparations, pointedly ignoring several raised hands from concerned residents. After the meeting, I considered approaching her directly with my discovery, but remembered the stack of ignored papers at the office. Instead, I returned home and sat at my kitchen table, rain beginning to tap gently against the windows as the leading edge of the storm system arrived. I drafted a final warning email specifically about the clubhouse vulnerability, detailing exactly what could happen if the rainfall matched predictions. My finger hovered over the send button as the clock on my wall ticked past midnight. The rational part of me knew I should send it, that preventing damage was the right thing to do regardless of how I had been treated. But another part of me, the part tired of being ignored and penalized for trying to do the right thing, held back. These people had forced me to remove a necessary safety feature from my home. They had dismissed my concerns and evidence repeatedly. Perhaps it was time for nature to demonstrate what I could not convince them of through words and documentation. In the end, I saved the draft but did not send it. Some lessons, I reasoned, had to be experienced to be truly understood. As the rain intensified outside my window, I went to bed knowing that the real storm, both meteorological and metaphorical, was just beginning. The storm arrived with a vengeance at 3:17 a.m., announced by a crack of thunder so loud it jolted me awake. Rain hammered against my roof and windows with a violence I had never experienced before. Flashes of lightning illuminated my bedroom in strobing bursts, revealing curtains billowing from windows I knew I had closed. The wind had forced its way through the smallest gaps, bringing with it the smell of ozone and wet earth. I grabbed a flashlight from my bedside table and made my way downstairs, flinching at another thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. In the basement, my fears were confirmed. Despite the sandbags, water had found its way inside. Not a flood, thankfully, but steady streams coming through the very section of wall that had previously been protected by my drainage system. I quickly placed buckets under the worst leaks and used old towels to create barriers directing water toward the floor drain. As I worked, I could not help but think about how unnecessary this all was. My removed drainage pipe would have prevented this entirely. For the next few hours, I monitored the leaks, emptying buckets and replacing soaked towels as needed. By dawn, the rain had not lessened. If anything, it had intensified. Through my rain-streaked windows, I could see the sandbags holding, but water was pooling in my yard with nowhere to go. The ground was completely saturated. With the first light of day, I grabbed my phone and began documenting everything. I filmed the water levels in my yard, the leaks in my basement, and the overwhelmed street drains. Then I had an idea. Donning a raincoat and waterproof boots, I ventured outside with my phone sealed in a plastic bag but positioned to record video. The rain was even more intense than it had appeared from inside. It fell in sheets, reducing visibility to just a few yards. I walked slowly, carefully filming how water was flowing across properties and down the street. It was no longer just flowing. It was rushing in newly formed streams following exactly the path I had predicted in my analysis. My feet splashed through ankle-deep water as I followed one particularly strong current. It gathered strength as tributaries from other properties joined it, all flowing inexorably toward the lowest point in the neighborhood, toward the clubhouse. As I rounded the corner, I could see the clubhouse in the distance. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Water was already pooling around its foundation, lapping at the bottom steps leading to its grand entrance. The recently landscaped gardens around the building had become shallow ponds. I was not the only one who had ventured out to witness the unfolding situation. Several neighbors stood under umbrellas at a safe distance, watching with expressions ranging from concern to morbid curiosity. I recognized Frank among them and approached him. "This is exactly what I warned them about," I said, having to raise my voice over the drumming rain. Frank nodded grimly. Several of us tried to tell Margaret the clubhouse was at risk. She said the drainage system they installed during the renovation would handle it. I looked back at the building skeptically. That system was designed for normal rainfall, not this. As we watched, the water level around the clubhouse visibly rose, now covering the first step entirely. Inside, through the large windows, we could see the expensive furniture, the new hardwood floors, and the elaborate decorations for the upcoming gala, all sitting just inches above what was quickly becoming a lake. A moral dilemma tugged at me. Should I try one last time to help? I could suggest emergency measures that might divert some of the water, potentially saving thousands of dollars in damages. But would they listen now after dismissing me repeatedly? Before I could decide, the distinctive sound of a luxury car engine cut through the rainfall. A white Mercedes SUV splashed through the flooded street and screeched to a halt near the clubhouse. Margaret emerged, her normally perfect hair plastered to her head within seconds despite her umbrella. She surveyed the scene with growing horror, then spotted our small gathering of observers. Her eyes locked on me, and she charged forward, seemingly oblivious to the deepening water soaking her designer shoes. "You," she shouted, pointing directly at my face, "you did this on purpose." The accusation was so unexpected that for a moment I could only stare at her in confusion. "Did what?" "You sabotaged the drainage around the clubhouse," she yelled, now close enough that I could see mascara running down her cheeks. "This is revenge for making you remove your pipe." Several neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Frank stepped forward. "Margaret, that is ridiculous. No one could cause this much rain. Not the rain, she snapped. He blocked the clubhouse drainage outlets, I know it. As absurd as the accusation was, I could see some neighbors looking at me with uncertainty. I opened my mouth to defend myself when a sharp cracking sound cut through the argument. We all turned toward the clubhouse just in time to see water rushing under the main doors, forced by rising levels outside. The doors are not waterproof beyond the first few inches, someone murmured. We watched in collective silence as water began pouring into the clubhouse lobby. The expensive area rugs began darkening as they absorbed water, and lighter decorative items started to float. Through it all, my phone continued recording, documenting the exact moment when nature delivered the verdict that human stubbornness had invited. Margaret rushed toward the building, pulling out keys and desperately trying to think of a way to stop the inevitable. But it was too late. Water continued to rise both outside and inside the structure. Standing in the rain, watching the clubhouse slowly fill with floodwater, I felt no satisfaction, only a grim confirmation of what I had predicted and tried to prevent. The gathering crowd of neighbors had grown, many filming the scene with their phones, creating dozens of records of what would later become a pivotal moment in our community's history. I tried to warn them. I said to no one in particular as thunder rumbled overhead, punctuating the moment like an exclamation mark at the end of a long-ignored sentence. Morning broke clear and bright as though the furious storm had never happened. Sunlight glinted off puddles and highlighted the debris left in the flood's wake. Throughout the neighborhood, residents emerged to assess damage and begin cleanup. For most homes, the impact was minimal: soggy lawns, scattered branches, and minor leaks. But the clubhouse told a different story. Yellow caution tape surrounded the building, and 2 fire department vehicles were parked nearby. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching as emergency responders pumped water from the interior. I approached slowly, my camera in hand to document the scene. The damage was immediately apparent and extensive. The elegant double doors stood propped open, allowing a steady stream of muddy water to flow out onto the once pristine patio. Through the doorway, I could see sodden carpets being torn up by workers in boots and gloves. Waterlogged furniture had been carried outside and arranged in forlorn rows on the lawn, expensive upholstery, now stained and ruined. A woman in a blue jacket with "insurance adjuster" embroidered on the breast pocket walked the perimeter, taking photographs and making notes on a tablet. Her expression was grim as she documented each detail of the destruction. Another person in a similar jacket measured the water line visible on the exterior walls, nearly 2 feet high at its peak. I kept a respectful distance but continued taking photographs for my own records. This was the exact scenario I had predicted in my report, now playing out in vivid, expensive detail. "Quite a mess," said a voice beside me. I turned to find Frank standing there, shaking his head at the scene. "They are estimating at least $200,000 in damages, maybe more once they assess the structural impact." Before I could respond, another neighbor joined us. Then another. Soon a small group had formed, and the conversation turned to the events leading up to the disaster. "Did you really warn them this would happen?" asked Carol, the neighbor who had avoided eye contact with me just days earlier. I nodded. I submitted detailed reports showing how removing my drainage pipe would redirect water flow toward the clubhouse. I also identified that the clubhouse sits at the lowest elevation point in the community. "I had drainage issues too," admitted another resident named Michael. "They made me remove my solution last year. My garage flooded last night." One by one, neighbors began sharing similar stories. Reasonable modifications denied, warnings ignored, arbitrary rule enforcement that had left many properties vulnerable to exactly this type of weather event. What had been whispered privately was now being spoken openly, creating a growing chorus of discontent. As we talked, I noticed a township vehicle pull up. A man in a county inspector uniform stepped out and approached the insurance adjusters. They talked briefly before he began his own examination of the building. I recognized an opportunity and approached him, introducing myself and explaining my background in engineering. I documented the water flow patterns during the height of the storm, I told him, showing him the videos on my phone. I also submitted reports to the HOA predicting this outcome when they forced residents to remove functional drainage solutions. The inspector looked at my evidence with professional interest. "Do you have copies of those reports and the HOA responses?" he asked. "Complete documentation, including timestamps, delivery confirmations, and their written rejections," I confirmed. "I can provide everything for your investigation." He handed me his card. "Please email all of that to this address. This will be relevant to both insurance coverage and potential code violation assessments." Word spread quickly about the inspector's interest in my documentation. By that afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting had been called to be held in the elementary school gymnasium since the clubhouse was unusable. Every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates received the notification. The gymnasium was filled beyond capacity that evening. The atmosphere crackled with tension as residents claimed seats on metal folding chairs or stood along the walls. The HOA board members sat at a table on the stage, looking uncomfortable under the harsh fluorescent lighting so different from the clubhouse's flattering ambience. Margaret called the meeting to order, her voice lacking its usual authority. "We are here to discuss the unfortunate damage to our community clubhouse and begin planning repairs." "Before we discuss repairs," interrupted a resident, "should not we discuss how this happened and who is responsible?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret tried to regain control, but the sentiment had already shifted. When my name was called to speak, the room fell expectantly silent. I walked to the microphone set up for resident comments, bringing with me a folder containing printouts of my reports, warnings, and the HOA's dismissive responses. I had prepared to speak with anger, but standing before my community, I chose a different approach. This was not about vindication, but about necessary change. "I am not here to assign blame," I began, my voice steady. "I am here to ensure we learn from this experience. For months, many of us have tried to implement practical solutions to protect our homes, only to be denied based on aesthetic concerns rather than functional necessity." I presented my documentation methodically, displaying key pages on the overhead projector. The evidence was incontrovertible, clear warnings provided, substantiated by engineering principles, summarily rejected without proper consideration. When I finished, the insurance company representative took the floor. He cleared his throat before delivering the news everyone was waiting for. "Based on our preliminary investigation, including documentation provided by multiple residents and the county inspector's report, we have determined that the damage resulted from negligence in water management despite documented warnings. This finding may affect coverage under the association's policy, specifically the clause regarding failure to take reasonable precautionary measures." The impact of his words was immediate. Margaret slumped visibly in her chair as whispers erupted throughout the gymnasium. The financial implications were enormous. If the insurance claim was denied, each homeowner would need to cover their share of repairs through special assessments. As the meeting continued, the community's frustration, long suppressed by fear of retaliation, finally found its voice. The seeds of change had been planted in the fertile ground of shared experience and documented truth. The official insurance letter arrived 3 weeks after the flood. It was promptly scanned and emailed to every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates, its contents sending shockwaves through the community. Claim denied due to documented negligence and failure to heed professional warnings regarding water management vulnerabilities. The letter detailed how multiple warnings from qualified residents had been ignored, how professional recommendations had been dismissed in favor of aesthetic considerations, and how the clubhouse's vulnerability had been specifically identified prior to the flooding event. The insurance company's conclusion was unambiguous. The HOA board had failed in its fiduciary duty to protect community assets. An emergency community-wide vote was scheduled immediately. The meeting hall was packed beyond capacity, with some residents watching via video link from an overflow room. When the motion for leadership change was presented, the outcome was never in doubt. Hands raised overwhelmingly in favor of removing the current board and establishing an interim leadership committee until formal elections could be held. Margaret and her allies did not attend the vote. Their absence spoke volumes about their recognition of the community's sentiment. I sat quietly during the proceedings, accepting occasional pats on the shoulder or whispered thanks from neighbors without obvious celebration. This was not a moment for gloating, but for rebuilding, both physically and in terms of community trust. After the vote, as people began filing out, Helen Chen, a retired civil engineer I had spoken with briefly at previous meetings, approached me. "We are forming an infrastructure committee to review all drainage and structural policies," she said. "Your background and attention to detail would be valuable. Would you consider joining?" The request surprised me. I had expected to be seen as the person who documented the problem, not someone to help create solutions. "I would be honored," I replied sincerely. Over the following weeks, our committee met regularly to develop new guidelines. We reviewed County standards, consulted with professional engineers, and most importantly, walked the neighborhood to understand its natural topography and water flow patterns. We identified other vulnerable areas and began planning comprehensive solutions. At each meeting, I brought my professional knowledge but also an understanding of balance. "We need standards," I explained during one session, "but they need to be based primarily on function and safety, with aesthetic considerations as secondary factors." The other committee members nodded in agreement. This perspective, once controversial, had become common sense in the wake of such expensive consequences. Spring arrived, bringing gentle rains that tested our new emergency measures. With temporary drainage solutions in place, the community weathered these early storms without incident. Meanwhile, contractors submitted bids for the clubhouse renovation, now redesigned to include proper water management systems. On a mild Saturday in April, exactly 6 months after I had been forced to remove my drainage pipe, I found myself installing a new one, this time with official permit in hand. The new system was similar to my original design, but incorporated improvements suggested by our committee's research. As I worked, several neighbors stopped by, some offering help, others seeking advice for their own properties. The clubhouse renovation progressed steadily throughout spring. The new design incorporated not just repairs but significant improvements to prevent future flooding. Permeable paving replaced concrete in the parking area, allowing water absorption. Rain gardens were strategically placed to capture runoff. Most importantly, a comprehensive drainage network was installed around the foundation, designed to handle even exceptional weather events. On the day of the clubhouse reopening, the entire community gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The new board president, Frank, who had been elected by a significant margin, gave a brief speech about lessons learned and the strength found in working together. When he invited me to join him in cutting the ribbon, I felt a sense of closure that transcended vindication. As we mingled afterward, Margaret approached me hesitantly. Our first encounter since the flood was understandably awkward, but necessary for community healing. Your drainage system design was incorporated into the renovation plans, she acknowledged, offering what appeared to be a difficult but sincere concession. The engineers said it was exactly what should have been there from the beginning. I nodded, accepting the olive branch for what it was.